Wing Commander arrived in 1990. Wing Commander came on the scene in 1990. It was a time of dramatic change for PC gaming. The first in the series had cartoonish graphics, no voices, an ear-grating MIDI soundtrack, and pixelated sprites simulating 3D objects and glorious 12 frames per second animation. Yeah, it was a rough time. The first installment was a huge success that spawned a series of games that told the story of humanity's war against the Kilrathi, an expansionist race of warrior cat people bent on wiping us out. The Wing Commander series spanned kind of the infancy to the young adulthood of video games as a storytelling medium. When Wing Commander 3 was released in 1994, PC games had already made huge strides forward. This game not only had 3D wireframe spacecraft instead of blocky sprites, but most dramatically, it abandoned the garish cartoon graphics of the first two in the series for live-action cutscenes that told the story. This wasn't entirely new. Many games released during those couple of years used highly compressed, janky live-action video that struggled to play off CD-ROMs. The Seventh Guest is arguably the most significant of that batch. I was never into it, but I knew people that thought it was amazing. But Wing Commander 3 upped the ante by casting good actors. Actors that you've seen in other stuff. Mark Hamill, Malcolm McDowell, John Rhys-Davies, and many other familiar faces. The casting brought depth to a story that could have come across as extremely schlocky with less capable actors. The Kilrathi are a bit of a weak point, achieved by having actors in Catman suits with these huge animatronic heads and limb prosthetics. Sort of Jim Henson meets Stan Winston. A bit jarring, though now I'm picturing the Predator hunting Fraggles, which kind of redeems it. The story also builds on the game mechanic of player choices having story consequences. You can lose. There are multiple endings. Though the existence of sequels after Game 3 implies a canon ending of human victory, so let's just assume that's how it went down. You played well, got the good ending, and we saw the end of the Kilrathi War with a daring attack that involved Mark Hamill's character, a fighter pilot for the Terran Confederation, flying down a trench and shooting a torpedo into a hole. Planet explodes. Just don't mess with the winning formula. These first three games in the series are about an all-encompassing war for survival. There's not much room for subtlety or gradations of morality. Either we win or we die. When the third game ends with the destruction of Kilra and the near genocide of the Kilrathi species, it's not presented as a terrible outcome we were forced into, but rather as a welcome end to the war. Even the Kilrathi survivors are remarkably understanding about the whole thing.
In my bones, I wish to kill you.
Do it then. It won't bring back your home world.
And a race without a home world. Unimaginable. The Kilrathi are a beaten race, and killing the one warrior great enough to bring about their end will bring me no honor. A new millennium lies ahead. We have become too corrupt and too much slaves to our bloodlust, and we have paid a heavy price. We are surrendering to you.
This could easily have been the end of the story from a narrative standpoint, but the game was a critical and financial success. 2 years later, Wing Commander 4 was released. Technology had improved and budgets were higher, and while the gameplay is very similar, this game's cutscenes look much better than the previous installment. Visually, it's sort of like Starship Troopers done in the style of Babylon 5. Wing Commander 4 is also in many ways the narrative height of the franchise. The war is over, the Kilrathi nearly wiped out, and huge numbers of soldiers and pilots are trying to adjust to peacetime after a life spent fighting bipedal sapient lion monsters. Mankind has been focused on the war, and now, with it over, there is a vacuum, a lack of purpose.
In the Kilrathi, we had a common enemy. It was humanity's finest hour. Now we cast about uncertain.
There are echoes of the post-Vietnam era, discarded veterans that don't fit into society and that society doesn't want.
Spare the price of a drink for no vet.
You were a flyer?
Oh, yeah, I flew off the TCS Liberty.
Oh. Do me a favor. Why don't you get out of here and get yourself a meal instead?
Hey, thanks, pal. I'll do that.
The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
And with the external threats removed, internal divisions rise to the surface. In this case, the border planets, long neglected by the Confederation, break away. Not in a dramatic call for secession, they just kind of ignore the Confederation and after a while call it independence.
Until we bring these perpetrators to justice, I'm afraid we must monitor all traffic flying under a different flag.
Naturally, this sparks some conflict and a minor civil war ensues. There's a lot happening with this conflict. On the surface, it's simply a long festering discontent in the border planets.
All I know is that the border worlds have always been Confed's stepchild. But they fought the Kilrathi too, but what do they get for it? Anytime Confed needs a dumping ground for anything from toxins to prisoners, the border world's the place. They treat it more like a colony than a partner.
It's implied that they bore the brunt of the war, losing territory and taking casualties to buy Earth time.
A lot of people think it was the border worlds who kept us in the war long enough for the colonel here to lower the boom.
And now they're rankled by the expectation that they should just fall back in line and be good vassals again. It's a problem that large states always face to some extent. The periphery is neglected except when it comes to extracting tax revenue. And that periphery doesn't have to be geographic. It can also be a cultural or socio-political split. It's only natural for people to not want to be exploited. This holds true whether we're talking about a small country or a galaxy. And war breeds paranoia. The early action takes place on the TCS Lexington, basically an aircraft carrier in space. And as the conflict with the border planets builds, the net of secrecy descends. New officers arrive. The captain is relieved of duty and confined to quarters without explanation. Parts of the ship become restricted to both you as the player and the other pilots.
Attention, all personnel without level 5 security clearance, leave the flight deck immediately. There will be no unauthorized access to the flight deck until further notice.
Pretty soon we're going to need a hall pass just to use the head.
It's a microcosm of a nation sliding into authoritarianism under the guise of security. Highly irregular actions are left unexplained. Be a good soldier. You don't need to know. It becomes increasingly clear that the authorities are lying about something, and questioning the lies is tantamount to siding with the enemy. You find yourself being told to defend something that is being torn down by the very people giving you the orders. The secrecy is because the war is being provoked by a faction within Earth's government that believes that humanity was made stronger by the war with the Kilrathi, and that we need to become even stronger to face the other threats that no doubt await in the galaxy. This also extends to genetically engineering stronger humans and using selective bioweapons to kill off the weak.
What's the pattern here? This is not random. The autopsies have been showing commonalities. Things like percentage of body fat, bone brittleness, eyesight, sperm and egg count. Everything genetically determined.
Space Nazis again. The Black Lance, as they're called, complete with black uniforms adorned with silver lightning bolts, are led by Admiral Tolwyn, played by Malcolm McDowell in his classic villain style. This is an instance where games as a medium work exceptionally well for long-form storytelling. Tolwyn as a character first appears in Wing Commander 2, and McDowell's portrayal is significant throughout the third game. There's a well-established background with the character and the moment of revelation that your old friend...
I know the destruction of the Tiger's Claw was your fault, and I still believe that you're guilty of treason.
Well, your old CO anyway, is a secret Nazi has more impact in the long-form interactive medium of a story-driven game than would be possible in a feature film and arguably in a single season of television. Because the player character has served with Tolwyn, because we as players got to know him when we were fighting on the same side, defending mankind from extermination, it's a more personal betrayal. And because of that background, we have a better understanding of Tolwyn. Like the discarded veteran in the bar we meet in the game's intro, Admiral Tolwyn too has no purpose without the war that consumed his life. He doesn't know how to do anything else besides defend humanity from enemies. In the absence of enemies, he has to find some. Unknown alien threats in the long term.
Now the truth is, our victory over the Kilrathi was not a clear verdict of our superiority. It was a fluke. a temporary purchase of time. We will someday face an enemy far worse than the Kilrathi, and it is our duty to prepare, to remain strong, and to remain vigilant.
Seditious colonies undermining the Confederation in the near.
As you all know, the border worlds are an enemy birthing in our midst. They threaten our unity, our strength, our humanity.
Peeling back the layers of space Nazi tropes and supervillain posturing, Tolwyn gives us a sense of how he became the villain. He has rational motives. His thinking is internally consistent. In his mind, he's doing the right thing. While it's a somewhat cheesy narrative shorthand, this spin on the space Nazi trope combined with a decision-based gameplay model allows for a deeper explanation of the idea that noble goals like protecting your people can be taken too far. As a player in an interactive narrative, you have to engage with the material rather than passively witnessing it. A few years later, this is done in a bit more detail in the Mass Effect series through Cerberus, another militarist humanist faction similar to Wing Commander's Black Lance. Organizations that kill humans to save humanity, start wars in the name of peace. But they aren't doing it out of mustache-twirling malice, but instead start from the reasonable premise that there are dangers that we must be strong enough to face if we're going to survive. They start with at least defensible principles, but as compromises and expediencies compound, things get well out of hand and the supposed protectors become destroyers. At this point, gamers take the decision and consequence mechanic for granted, but non-gamers may not be familiar with it. So, a quick rundown is that your choices affect the story. Characters can die because of choices you make. The story can end with you as a hero, as a traitor, as a washed-up failure, even promoted to admiral, serving as a troubled functionary of a brutal regime fighting an unjust war. This not only gives the game some replay value, but from a narrative standpoint, it gives us the possibility of much more involved storytelling than purely linear media can provide. If you as a player have the opportunity to side with the villains of the story, those villains need something appealing about them, whether it's a compelling argument or a personal connection. The characters need to be well constructed and their perspective needs to make sense, at least from their standpoint. This not only opens the possibility for some nuanced questions of morality, but it allows the audience to grapple with all sides of it, put each side on and walk around in it, consider the problem from within. And when done well, it forces us to step out of our assumptions and consider the other's perspective. It's a valuable skill that is too often neglected. The Black Lance is hammed up a little too much to really achieve that here, and the game doesn't allow you to openly side with them, which I think is a bit of a cop-out on the part of the writers. But Wing Commander 4 is perhaps the point where games really grew into their own as a narrative medium. The point where a game had the same claim to literary legitimacy as a film or a novel. I'm not saying it's Dostoevsky, but it's certainly on par with, say, Scalzi. So an example of what I'm talking about is that during the early fighting between the border planets and the Confederation, the player is faced with a choice between duty to his country and duty to his friends.
Sometimes what you believe is more important than any flag. We gotta stick with the guys we can trust.
It's a choice that dramatically affects the game thereafter. It decides which side of the war you fight on. It's impressive when we realize that every option had to be shot live action. Now it's done with CGI, only the voiceovers have to be recorded for multiple variations before turning it all over to the animation team. But in this case, every outcome had to be shot with actors on set. It's like shooting several versions of the same movie all at once, just in case you might decide in post that your villain is actually your hero, and you need to follow different characters for the whole second half. Wing Commander 4 is arguably the closest thing to an interactive film that we've seen, and it could only happen in that narrow window of time where home PC technology was good enough to play hours of video during a game. But professional 3D animation was so basic that live-action cutscenes were the only way to achieve acceptable results. There may never be another game quite like it, and I think it deserves recognition for its place in a still underappreciated narrative medium. It also reminds us that the end of the war is not the end of the story. Every victory sets the stage for another conflict. And maybe deciding whether to let that drive us to despair or instead think of it as leveling up goes a long way to deciding what kind of a people we are, both individually and as a civilization. So after several requests, I watched Wizards the other night. That's coming.